All right, so presuppositional apologetics, Christianity in full retreat. All right, so the question is, what is it, first of all? Where did it come from? And why do I believe it will actually hasten the decline of Christianity? Okay, so it was Cornelius Van Til who said, without the God of the Bible, the God of authority, the God that is self-contained and therefore incomprehensible to men, there would be no reason in anything. What Van Til called Dutch neo-Calvinist theology, with his 1950s American evangelicalism, and what he did was use those two elements to come up with his presuppositionalism. He spent 43 years at the Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He did a lot of writing, and he was able to establish a pretty good following for this presuppositionalism following his time there. Some of the folks that have taken this up more recently, kind of in the in-between period of Van Til and today, was Dr. Greg Bahnsen, the late Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Dr. Jason Lisle, whose book I critiqued last month. Eric Hovind, you may know Eric Hovind. He is the son of Kent Hovind. It's a gentleman by the name of Dustin Seegers out of North Carolina. Kerrigan Skelly. And then the gentleman I debated last June, Cy ten Broeke. Cornelius Van Til is arguing is that God is the very emplacement, the foundation upon which any argument rests. And therefore, to know anything requires that God to exist. Okay? What you could see was that Cornelius Van Til was frustrated mid-century with kind of the decline of Christianity in America, with the decline of the traditional evidence-based approach. So he tried to shift the debate away from the evidence to the underlying foundations of knowledge itself. Okay? What he's doing, in a sense, is arguing for the primacy of God. That God has to be there in order for anything to exist or for us to know anything. Okay? As I was talking to some of you before the meeting started, what he is doing, in essence, perhaps unknowingly, is he's actually arguing for the primacy of existence and just using God as a metaphor for that existence, and then there's a couple of other tricks that are used to try to twist that into the Christian God specifically. Now, Van Til considered himself what's called a Kuyperian, and Kuyper was the originator of what's called neo-Calvinism. He agreed with Kuyper that Christ not only has dominion over the world, but is also the sustainer of all existence. And that'll become important later on when we talk about sustaining uniformity of nature and some other... okay. But the problem is that Van Til suffers from the same dilemma that Kuyper suffered from, and like I said, being able to separate his God from mere existence itself. Or, to put it more philosophically, the Christian apologist D.R. Truthowy describes Van Til's attempt to rescue his God from a metaphor or a symbolic representation for reality, dogmatic, transcendental irrationalism, which he has attempted to give a Christian name to. Okay? What he's basically saying is, with a priori meaning being stated as a matter of fact and dogmatically without justification. So he's saying God is there, he's expressing this dogmatically without justification, transcendentally transcends space and time. Irrationalism obviously is not being rational. So he's basically just stating with no good justification that God is the foundation of everything. And then, like I said, trying to shoehorn the Christian God into that position. Okay? But despite these derogatory comments and some criticism of the time, he still was able to create a pretty good alternative to traditional evidential approach and create a bit of a following. Okay? The problem is that today, especially with the internet, Christian fundamentalism, and I would say creationism specifically, it's debunked at what we call web speed. So it's very easy to see their arguments and be able to counter them and debunk them quite quickly. So what Van Til did, and I'll liken this to Star Trek. There's a simulation in which the Starfleet cadets are put in essentially a no-win situation. Okay, so it's a computer simulation that they have to try to figure out a way out of. No cadet had ever figured a way out of this, and they essentially resigned themselves to defeat and destruction of their ship. Well, what Captain Kirk did, Cadet Kirk did, was he went into the computer, reprogrammed the simulation so there was a way out. So he was able actually to figure out a way to do that and to beat the system, as it were. Unfortunately for the presuppositionalists, who's kind of doing the same thing, reality is not a simulation. We're dealing with reality, and there's no way to change the program, as it were. Okay. So now that we have kind of the basics of what presuppositionalism is, we really ask the question, how does the presuppositionalists pull this off? How do they specifically try to achieve their objective? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Try to attack our basis for knowledge, our non-God-centered basis for knowledge. And second, once they've done that, is they'll try to fill in the void with their particular God. Okay, and I'm going to let our buddy Cy Ten Brugengate tell us exactly.
I go out to the universities. My very first question, could you be wrong about everything you claim to know?
Anybody could be, we all could be wrong.
If you could be wrong about everything you claim to know, you don't know anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really know anything.
Colossians 2, 2 and 3. In Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. If you don't start with God, you can't know anything. You've affirmed that. You need to repent.
But could you be wrong about everything you claim to know?
Yes.
You could be wrong.
Yes.
So you could even be wrong about the existence of God.
I could.
Not only could you be wrong about what I can know, you could be wrong about the fact that you could be wrong about everything you claim to know. I said, that's your option. God, absurdity. So if somebody says, I really don't believe in God, you have to address it. I'm not going to try and prove him by saying, look at the complexity of the eye. You're not talking about the complexity of the eye, you're destroying worldviews.
Okay. Make sense?
No.
No? Now, I'm going to play another...
Well, let's take a look at
explains a little more detail.
Let's pick something to...
I know A. What's the next question? How do you know A? Well, I know A because of B. Well, how do you know B? I know B because of C. How do you know C? I know C because of D. How do you know D? Because of A, because of E, because of F, because of G, because of H. Do you know where that ends? Not at the end of the alphabet. It doesn't end. It's an infinite regress. It's an infinite regress of, and how do you know that? You see, in order to stop that infinite regress, you have to know everything. Or have a revelation from someone that does. Well, who knows everything? Who knows everything? God. God knows everything. Now, what's the Christian claim to knowledge? We know things by and through revelation from God who knows everything. The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. All the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden in Christ. Basically, in order to know anything, you need to start with God. Now, if my opponent was intellectually honest, and I hope that he is, he'd be forced to concede that an all-knowing, all-powerful being could reveal some things to us such that we can know them for certain. God could give us knowledge. The question becomes, though, how does he know anything? How does Dan escape that infinite regress? Quite simply, he can't. Now, what do many atheists do when I point that out, that they can't know anything without God? They often say, okay, I can't know anything, but either can you. To which I reply, if you can't know anything, how can you know what I can know? You see, they deny knowledge, and the very first thing out of their mouth is a knowledge claim. Now, Dan might just say, okay, I don't know anything, and stop right there. Well, what's wrong with that? To say that you don't know anything is to make a knowledge claim. You're basically saying, I know that I don't know anything, which is self-refuting. So to recap, debates assume knowledge, and knowledge assumes God. Just as speaking exposes a pre-commitment to words, debating exposes a pre-commitment to God, to knowledge, and knowledge exposes a pre-commitment to God. By showing up here today, Dan presupposed knowledge, and in so doing, exposed his pre-commitment to God. Just by showing up today, Dan lost the debate. The proof that God exists is that without him you couldn't know anything. Now, I'm not saying that Dan doesn't know anything, but that he exposes his pre-commitment to God with every knowledge claim he makes. And he will make knowledge claims. Now, I don't give that proof with the expectation that Dan or any of you will accept it. Proof does not equal persuasion. But if Dan wishes to refute my proof, he will have to demonstrate how he can know anything apart from God.
You hear in this, Sai actually makes a couple of good questions. One is, how does Dan escape the infinite regress? B because of A, C because of B, and so forth. So I'm going to answer that question. And he gives me essentially the formula for defeating his position. He says, if I want to refute his proof, I'll have to demonstrate how I can know anything apart from God. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to show how to escape the infinite regress and to know anything apart from God. Okay? First, a couple of definitions so we can get there. Axiom, a statement accepted as true is the basis for argument or inference. Logic, the science of the formal principles of reasoning. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion today, knowledge, justify true belief. By the way, there's lots of different definitions of knowledge. This is the definition of knowledge that most presuppositionalists, including Cy Grubenkay, will use. So we'll work from this standpoint. Okay. All right. It was the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein who said, "If I have exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned. Then I am inclined to say, this is simply what I do." Now, the bedrock that he's talking about are the axioms that we just mentioned. The foundation of the base assumptions from which everything, or all knowledge, is built. Now, these axioms are necessary truths, and I'll give you an example. I exist. The opposite of I exist is I do not exist. But the statement I do not exist is self-refuting because of the I in the statement itself. Therefore, the proposition that I exist is a necessary truth and cannot be. Okay? That's the basis of what an axiom is. It's something that not in itself doesn't require an additional justification. It's simply true based upon the impossibility of the contrary. Okay. Let's also look at some other axioms that come to us from classical logic. Law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A in the same manner at the same time. Also what's called the excluded middle. A statement cannot be both true and false in the same manner at the same time. And the law of identity and object is the same as itself. Okay? They seem a little bit strange, but these are really the foundations, the axiomatic foundations of logic. All right. So what we're doing, in order to avoid the infinite regress, we simply have to understand where, quote, as Wittgenstein said, that is, just justifications must stop, the bedrock. Where we can go no further, we must assume a position, not because we want to assume it, but because the contrary position is simply impossible. Now there's other axioms as well. I'm not going to list them all, but some of the basic axioms are assuming that reality exists. There's some reality to know. That we exist within that reality, and we can interact with that reality through our senses. We also must assume, as an axiom, that our senses are at least provisionally valid. That is, that we can have some actual sense of reality. And finally, what's called the uniformity of nature. I'll explain that a little bit more in a few minutes. Okay? Again, I'll get into these in more detail, but I just want to show you quite simply that there are bedrock axioms, things that we must assume, starting point from which we can then build our knowledge. Okay. First of all, our axioms are necessarily true. We obviously believe them. So the only thing we need to go from an axiom to knowledge is the justification. Okay? And it's these justifications that come in to us through our senses. Okay? So, for example, you're going to see in the next clip, Saitem Bruggencate makes a claim about not really being able to know the speed limit on a particular street. It's kind of a strange claim. But for us, for me, all we really need to do is to look at the speed limit sign to know what the speed limit is. I know it seems kind of obvious, but what we're doing is we're taking that image in through our eyes, the reality is coming in through our senses, we're comparing it to our memory of what the symbols mean, and then we know what the speed limit is. It's really quite simple. Okay? So, we've achieved our objective. We've escaped the infinite regress, stopping at our axioms, and we've been able to establish knowledge without God. So I've met the criteria that Sai has laid out. So you could say presuppositionalism fails. It's really quite simple. But only if the presuppositionalist was so honest and gave up so easily, it'd be all over. But what the presup is really going to ask us for is absolute certainty, absolute knowledge. The problem is that justifications coming in through our senses, like reading the street sign, can be mistaken. We can't be absolutely certain that we're not being deceived or somehow distorting the image or getting false information. I thought this was kind of a neat optical illusion. If you look at it, it looks, you see that? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. The fact is that's a completely static picture. So that was just an example of an optical illusion. We can't always be 100% sure that our sense information is accurate. Okay? Let me play another clip of Saitem Bruggencate where he's talking about this absolute certainty.
I only asked one question of Dan this afternoon. I had 38 questions written down. Why did I ask Dan only one question? I asked him if he could be wrong about everything he claims to know. If you can be wrong about everything you claim to know, you can't know anything. And I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody asked me what the speed of the road was out there. And I said, I know it to be 30 miles per hour, but I could be wrong. Does that person know it? No, he does not. So when you say that you can be wrong about everything you claim to know, you don't know anything. And this debate is over. Because Dan's going to come up here and he's going to have rebuttals to all of my questions. He can say, well, Sai said that, therefore this. And he's going to make a knowledge claim. And that's right. I will say, how do you know that? How do you know that when you say you can be wrong about everything you claim to know? Because you could be wrong. And if you could be wrong, you don't know it.
Okay? So he's asking for absolute certainty. So without absolute certainty, he's claiming you don't know anything, which is bizarre, but that's the claim. So what I'm saying is there is no absolute certainty, but we do take our sense information as what I call provisionally true. At least the first, I'll use the term sense in two different ways. The first sense of the information coming in through our senses of sight, hearing, and so forth, is that the information is correct. That's the only way you can really interact with reality. We must accept these as provisionally true, as provisionally valid, in other words. In other words, we must accept our sense information as initially valid in order to have any reaction to it at all. Consider, for a moment, you didn't trust any of your sensory input, okay? You'd have no ability to interact with reality at all. Imagine yourself sitting in a car at a stoplight, in a red light, and suddenly you no longer accept any sensory perception as valid, okay? The light changes to green, but you don't trust it's green, so you just sit there. You look at the road, but you don't really trust that the road is real. You can't even know if you're sitting in a car, or even if there's any reality at all. In short, you cease to have anything that passes for consciousness. That's why we must accept our sense information as at least initially valid. The first thing to understand is, even for the presuppositionalists, the knowledge of anything, including the knowledge of their God, is coming to them through their senses. And even the presup will confess that their sense perceptions are not perfect, so no matter what source, they cannot have certain knowledge, or in other words, knowledge without the possibility of error. So the certain knowledge that they claim from their supposedly omniscient God, they can't have themselves the certainty of this knowledge because it comes in through their own senses. Omniscience itself, or infinite knowledge, is a meaningless concept. Omniscience, or infinite knowledge, would require infinite justification, because again, knowledge is justified true belief. But infinite is not a fixed number. It's not a fixed quantity. It's a concept that represents no limit. What omniscience requires is justifications chasing knowledge claims without limit. An infinite regress, if you would, of A because of B, B because of C, C because of D, etc., with no end. The same infinite regress that the presup has already rejected. So they've already given their own argument for why omniscience is not possible. Okay. So the presuppositionalist next line of attack is what's called the uniformity of nature. This is a very interesting phenomenon. In an online debate with the atheist experience commentator Russell Glasser, this gentleman by the name of Stephen Feinstein, a presuppositionalist, argued, he said, quote, all science rests on the precondition of the uniformity of nature. In other words, inductive inference takes something that we've experienced in the past and then projects it into the future. Okay? The argument is that without this behavior, called the uniformity of nature, we could draw no conclusions from experiments because repeating the same test would not necessarily provide the same results. We conduct experiments to learn things, but if we duplicated the experiment exactly and didn't get the same result, we would be very surprised. Okay? The uniformity of nature is axiomatic. It's one of our axioms. It's axiomatic to science and is required to make any inductive inference. On this point, the presuppositionalists and the atheists can agree. It is required to make experiments mean anything and to be able to have inductive inference. But in order to create a need for their God, the presuppositionalist goes one step further. He will insist that the presumption of uniformity must be justified, and he does this by positing his God as that justification. As Dr. Greg Bahnsen stated, God created the world and this world reflects the uniformity that he imposes on it by his governing. And our thinking is to reflect the same consistency or logical coherence that is in God's thinking. Okay, and I underline the part where it says he imposes on it. Let's keep that in mind. Or as Dr. Jason Lyle said, the biblical creationist expects there to be order in the universe because God made all things and has imposed order on the universe. Now, you might be seeing what they're doing here, but by asserting that God is required to impose uniformity on nature, the presuppositionalist must assume the uniformity of God. The argument is that God is inherently orderly and operates in a uniform manner. The presuppositionalist does this while he denies uniformity as an inherent characteristic of nature itself. This is the type of special pleading where the presuppositionalist will insist that everything requires the imposition of uniformity except the one thing that he wishes to exempt from this requirement, in this case, is God. Or as a critic of presuppositionalists put it, to suppose that the uniformity of nature is an effect of some prior cause would commit the fallacy of the stolen concept. For it would need to presume the uniformity of the nature of the agent, the God, allegedly responsible for causing uniformity in nature. And Dawson Betherick goes by the blog titled Bunsen Burner. The presuppositional also goes on to claim that the atheist has only random chance as the governing principle of the universe, and this randomness cannot account for that uniformity. Back to Stephen Feinstein again in his blog debate to Russell Glasser, who says, your fundamental assumption is that the universe is governed by random chance. How in the world can randomness account for uniformity? Question. But what the precept is, he's using a trick, the same trick that he did with the foundation of knowledge. What he's looking for is a type of justification that would be provided to support a knowledge claim. But uniformity is not, as the precept would have us think, one of two options. It's the only option. It's an axiom because of the impossibility of the contrary, and therefore it doesn't have or need an external justification. So, what are the claim that the atheist posits random chance as the governing principle of the universe? The claim commits what's called the equivocation fallacy. Equivocation is when a word that has more than one meaning is used incorrectly. The first equivocation has to do with the word govern in that statement. Now, if an atheist says that the laws of physics govern the universe, they're simply saying that there are laws that describe the observed behavior of the universe. But what the precept suggests is that the universe is controlled, when he uses the term govern, and he states that the atheist believes that the universe is controlled by randomness. But what the precept has done is claim that the atheist is using the term govern in what's called a prescriptive sense, when in fact the atheist is actually using the term in a descriptive sense. Does that make sense? Prescriptive would be to impose something. Descriptive means to simply describe what they're seeing. So, if I gave an analogy, say if I was to drop something and gravity was pulling it down, what the presuppositionalist is saying is the idea of gravity is forcing that object down. And that's not what the atheist is saying at all. The atheist is saying the law of gravity, as it were, simply describes the inherent behavior of mass being attracted to mass. It's a descriptive sense. It's not controlling, it's simply describing what's happening. Okay. Now the precept will claim that random and uniform are antonyms, as in mutually exclusive opposites, random versus uniform. They would be antonyms if random was used in the sense of disordered and uniform was used in the sense of ordered. But when the atheist says something is random, he or she is using what I'm calling an epistemological shortcut. In other words, what they're saying is that random means I simply don't know the details of what's happening, or the results of the causes are too complex to practically evaluate. So for example, if I said the grains of sand in a sand dune were random, we recognize that the grains are positioned due to the wind, gravity, particle size, and other factors too numerous or difficult to understand. In this sense, we say that the sand is arranged randomly. It's a descriptive sense, not a prescriptive sense. Okay? Now, the precept will also assert that the atheist cannot account for the uniformity of nature in a constantly changing universe, and this is one of my favorites. On Eric Hoven's show called Creation Today, a year ago in September, again, it was Saitem Bruggencate, asked atheists Alex Bowden and Jim Gardner this question. He asked, if change is a characteristic of the universe, how can you have unchanging laws that are also a characteristic of the universe? Seems like a good question. But again, the presuppositionalist is equivocating. Previously, he had used the term uniformity to represent the laws by which the universe behaves. In other words, he's saying that the process must be consistent or uniform. But with the changing universe argument, he's moving away from the description of how matter and energy interact and pointing to the matter and energy directly. It's as if he's saying the cars on the highway are uniform if we're all traveling at the same speed, and then arguing that the cars are not uniform if they're moving. Okay, so he's changing the criteria. Uniformity only applies to the laws in a descriptive sense and not to the material universe that is constantly in flux. So again, it's another trick they're trying to pull to confuse people. Okay, love and morality. This is another way they try to shoehorn the Christian God into the equation. The presuppositionalists will insist that only the specifically triune or Trinitarian God of the Bible can account for love and morality. First, on the idea of love, the precept will argue that only a triune God can provide a grounding for love because the Trinitarian God had someone to love. I guess Father, Son, Holy Ghost, whatever. And therefore, we can know what love is. In other words, we have an ultimate standard for love. That's the presuppositionalist argument. Okay. Let's set aside the contradiction for a second of a triune God for a moment. The idea of grounding a term doesn't really help. Love, like any other word, conveys conceptual cargo when both the speaker and the listener assign the same meaning to the term. Take the word torch, for example. If I asked you to bring me a torch, you might be inclined to refuse because of the fire hazard. But if I asked for a torch in England, they wouldn't hesitate. The consensus in the US is that a torch means something with an open flame. But in England, it's simply a portable light. The word gets its grounding, if you would, by consensus. And that consensus can change over time and location. What if I said the word spam? How many people would think of the canned meat from Hormel? Okay? How many people would think of unwanted emails? Okay? That's an example of how new meanings come to our lexicon, and we assign by mutual agreement what the meanings of those words are. That's the grounding. That's the only grounding. So this idea of having a Trinitarian God be the grounding for love is complete nonsense. Love has meanings because we agree on the emotional content of what that represents. That's how words get their meaning. You can also see why the presuppositionalist tries to convince us that love needs a grounding. How else can you explain this uniplural deity that otherwise makes no sense at all? It's really just a word game used to confuse and trick people into accepting their flawed ideas. Okay. What about morality? Okay, I'm going to let Cy describe their position.
Well, what about morality? Tonight you may hear our opponents say that there's too much evil in this world for an all-good God to exist. But my question is this. If there is no God, by what absolute standard do you call anything evil? You see, the evil in this world is not a logical objection to Christianity, who has an absolute standard of morality, but it's a logical objection for the atheist who does not. The Christian says that morality is derived from the nature of God. When our opponents raise moral objections to Christianity, they're borrowing the absolute standard of morality from our worldview and actually proving that God exists. Now, they might say that they don't need God for their moral standard. Man has the right to live by his own law. That's what it says on their website. But says who? What obliges anyone to live by that standard? Do our atheist friends even live by their own standard? Well, let's see. If man has the right to live by his own law, doesn't the democratically elected mayor of this city have the right to live by his own law and institute prayer and council meetings? Well, apparently not. Our atheist friends regularly protest the mayor's right to live by his own law, and they violate their own standard. The question becomes, though, what obliges advanced bags of primordial slime, us, to live by any law? The fact is, folks, there could be no moral obligations of any kind without God. When they argue that there are, they're proving that God exists.
So you can see what the argument that they're using is pretty much the classic Christian, and it's not really unique to presuppositionalism when it comes to the morality part. But the biggest problem with what they're doing in trying to base morality, to establish a basis for morality, is it divorces the consequence from the action. In other words, an act is moral according to the Christian if it's commanded by God, regardless of the harm it's caused. Now, the Christian would counter that God knows everything and would only allow such harmful things to happen for some greater good in the future. The problem with this, of course, is that an omnipotent God wouldn't need to cause or even allow any suffering at all to achieve his purpose. This is the old problem of evil that Christianity has never had a good answer for. So the presuppositionalists and the Christians in general, or for them, morality comes down to obedience to a text. Fortunately for even the most fundamentalist Christians, they don't take this view of morality seriously. Otherwise, we'd have a lot of people being stoned to death. What we do know is morality is a combination of evolved intuitions and reasoning. Evolved because we're social animals and the ability to cooperate is essential to our survival. And reasoning comes in with our ability to predict the consequences of our actions. And it is the consequences that are the objective measure of whether an act is moral, not whether it's written in an ancient text. Finally.
But what about truth? What is truth to an evolutionist? The best that an evolutionist can hope for is believing this has helped me to survive. If all we are is evolved chemical reactions, how do you get to this is true? As Doug Wilson argued, if we're just advanced chemical reactions debating over which one of us is speaking the truth, we'll be on par with shaking up a bottle of Mountain Dew on this table and a bottle of Dr. Pepper on that table, opening them up and deciding which chemical reaction is producing true fizz and which chemical reaction is producing false fizz. Chemical reactions do not produce truth. For truth, you need God. But Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. When our opponents make truth claims, they'll be borrowing the concept of truth from Christianity and actually proving that God exists.
Now, I have to confess, when I first heard this argument, It took me a few days to figure it out, and I'm actually a little embarrassed about it because the flaw in the reasoning is so obvious. Maybe that's why I didn't see it at first. Sai talks about trying to determine which is true fizz and which is false fizz. Ask questions. If we're all just evolved chemical reactions, how do you get to this is true? Well, it seems like a good question. How do you go from evolution to knowing what's true? How can a physical process produce truth? The answer is it can't. And thus it would seem like the Presup has scored a major victory. Until you realize what truth is. Truth is not a physical object. Truth is not the result of some physical process, like evolution or fizzing. Truth is a concept. Truth is a label we apply to statements, specifically propositions. A proposition is true if it corresponds with reality. Asking how a physical process like evolution produces truth is a total non sequitur. But if truth corresponds to reality, the Presup will ask, whose reality? The Hindu believes that the world rests on a turtle. It's his or her reality. So whose reality should we use? It's very clever. It's a very clever question. But once again, they are intentionally, although I think some may be intentionally ignorant at this point, but they're intentionally misrepresenting what reality is. Well, we'll construct models of reality. We're not talking about assessing a statement as true by corresponding to a model of reality, but to reality itself. And we do this through evidence. Think this way. We experience reality through our senses, and every day our senses are providing some small pieces of that reality. We can't experience the totality of reality all at once, so we create models from the pieces that we get. If we then represent an aspect of that model with a statement, say the sky is blue, we can then compare that statement to our sense perceptions and determine if the statement is true. In other words, it corresponds to reality. The presuppositionalist definition of truth is that which corresponds to the mind of God. But neither a disembodied mind nor the very notion of the Christian God itself is a coherent concept. So sticking it in between ourselves and reality is not only unnecessary, it completely destroys the notion of truth. So what are we left with? And wrong about the need for his imaginary deity to have knowledge. He's wrong about the uniformity of nature and the very notion that uniformity needs to be sustained in nature. He's wrong about love needing to be grounded in the sense that they use grounding. He's wrong, I would say dangerously wrong, about the idea of morality. And they're wrong about the idea of truth. But it's not just the Presup is wrong from one end of his argument to the other. It's that he's thrown in the towel on any honest discussion of the evidence and retreated behind equivocation and confusion in a desperate attempt to postpone imminent defeat. He does this while lobbing grenades at his own troops that are still willing to man the barricades.
I've heard it said, good Christians, friends of mine, you know what? I could be wrong. I could be wrong about this God. They give you something like Pascal's wager. Folks, Pascal's wager is a terrible bet. It's a terrible bet. Something, Pascal's wager? I Googled that. I like Googling. I could not find one negative thing written about Pascal's wager. Not one. Go home, do it yourself. Look it up, Pascal's wager. I'm sure you've heard of it before, too. I mean, I used to use it. I used to tell people, well, if I'm wrong, no big deal. But if you're wrong, that's a probable God. That's not the God we believe in. So do we defend a probable God or a certain God in the world?
Well, let's look at some common arguments for the existence of God. I'll go through them quickly. I'm not very well schooled. I used to really know these arguments really well because that's what my website was built on. When I was starting this website, proving the existence of God, I was learning all of these arguments, and I learned them well. And I talked to Christians about them, and they said, wow, that's fantastic. You got to get out there. You got to use these arguments. And I would go online, I'd use these arguments, and I'd get them thrown back in my face. And it was so frustrating. I used these arguments, and people, you know, they just stonewalled me. They would throw the arguments back, and I didn't know why. Well, I'm going to tell you why. Those arguments are bad arguments. Arguments for the existence of God. The cosmological argument basically says everything which begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, so it must have a cause. That cause must itself be an uncaused cause or a God. Therefore, God exists. That sound familiar? I used to love that argument. Everything which begins to exist has a cause. We know the universe began to exist. It must have a cause. That cause must be an uncaused cause. That cause is God. Cosmological argument, in a nutshell. Problems with the cosmological argument. How do you know that everything which begins to exist has a cause? Have you observed this? How do you know that everything began to exist? Why do all these things have to have one cause and not multiple causes? Everything which we observe to begin to exist has a natural cause. Why must the ultimate cause be a supernatural God? Why does that God not need a cause? If that God doesn't need a cause, why does the universe need a cause? Even if that cause is a God, which God is it? This used to be my favorite argument. It's garbage.
What he's doing is trashing the conventional evidence-based arguments for God. Anyway, in fairness, he goes on to say that although he doesn't like the arguments, he likes the conclusion because they supposedly point to the same God that he's trying to argue for. Ironic. So I just want to be clear about that. He's not saying that the conclusions are wrong, he's just saying that the arguments are bad. All right, so although I think presuppositionalism in general is a clever ploy, ultimately I see it as a sign that fundamentalists and creationists are coming to terms with the overwhelming evidence that they're seriously out of step with reality. They have burned their bridges, as we just saw, to traditional arguments and set up their imaginary defenses behind wordplay and deception. They're running from any serious defense of the faith, even as they claim to be defending it. And now that I've figured out their game, apologists such as Carrick and Skelly, I emailed him and asked him for a debate. Well, he doesn't have time. That's what he told me. I sent several messages to Eric Hovind and asked to debate. Well, he's in Florida. I'll come down, debate you there. He won't even acknowledge my request. And I know that Cy Ten Bruggencate, who's been on Eric's show several times, and I have Cy's email address. I asked Cy several times to pass my request on, and Cy refuses, although he did say that Eric has watched the video of our debate together. So I know that they're in communication, but Eric won't even acknowledge my request to debate. And finally, Cy himself, just recently I said, well, nobody else will debate me, Cy. Maybe we need to go do a round two. Now we know each other a little bit better. And Cy's answer was, no way. Right? So they call themselves apologists, but they wouldn't even defend their positions. That's why I say presuppositionalism is Christianity in